Okay, so hello everybody. It is currently April 6th. Uh, we are at the end, basically, of like the instruction portion, more or less, of Unit 3. We're kind of finishing up this week. Uh, so you're going to be turning in your Unit 3 rough drafts, obviously. Um, and then I will give you feedback on that. You'll also be doing peer review with one another too. But after this week, we're moving on to stuff for Unit 4, which is going to be a little bit weird because, in many ways, I'm going to be teaching you how to do like public speaking stuff, which would be better suited to, say, giving a speech on a public occasion in front of people. Um, but the way we're going to be doing it, well, we'll get into that, but we'll be recording it. That's the short answer for that. Um, However, getting back to Unit 3 though, because we're still in it more or less. The discussion boards are looking good. I haven't graded like every single response to the various prompts. However, I've looked over them, and I look over them before I make these. Obviously, I'm really heartened by a lot of the responses to the prompts. In general, it looks like most, if not all of you, are on the right track, and I've jumped in at times to make suggestions and things like that. But I'm getting through grading those. Um, I will say though that if you feel a bit lost at this point with Unit 3, you might not know or feel like you know how to do anything in relation to Unit 3, and I've gotten a few messages like that. You can still get in touch with me via email, and we can walk through what you might need for this assignment. And in fact, today, in looking at the second sample, I'm going to more explicitly focus on those things, for instance, that I'll be grading on. So I'll be talking about what your paper needs and how that sample sort of fulfills it. I suggest for those of you who are maybe picking these up, you know, trying just to look at the most current ones, I suggest going back to that first one I made and looked at for the sample about pro football players, because I sort of run through most of that with an eye for what you need to do for your paper also. So this video in conjunction with that one are going to give you, I think, a good sense of what you're going to need. But if you still have any questions about that, like I said, email me. I have conferences that are going on this week with students that want to talk to me about their projects and get feedback on ideas that they have. I much rather enjoy doing, or rather do that than go through uh, just, let's say, emailing back and forth or commenting on things in like text format. You can reach me. If obviously I'll answer emails, I'll answer any questions like in those emails, but I highly encourage you to take up like conferences because basically I'm more or less in my office hours all the time, and so there's like really any time that you can think about is probably available to you for such a thing. All right, so you're going to be turning in your rough draft ideally on Wednesday. This week, per the schedule that I'm already kind of playing fast and loose with, that was mostly supposed to be devoted to peer review for this week. So I'm gonna have this lecture and then also a second one though later on in the week, probably on like Thursday or something, Thursday or Friday about the rubric, and I'll talk more about what's going to be in that lecture towards the end of this video. So when you turn in your Unit 3 rough draft, you're going to be assigned peer review partners about, let's say, a day or two afterward. or possibly on Saturday. I think Saturday is when I have it set up. When you turn it in, you're going to be assigned a peer review partner. I think 2 of them actually. I want you to do what we had been doing in class for these peer reviews, except now obviously in digital format. I want you to use the I heard, I noticed, I wondered form of peer review. This is mandatory to get full credit for the draft. Now, there are issues with the peer review system on Canvas, but I already know what they are. So if you have difficulties, I'll address those on an individual basis with the affected people. If you receive, for instance, if you receive rather two peer drafts and you're able to give commentary on them and submit it and it's all good, then you don't have to worry about anything. But if you don't, if that scenario doesn't go at all smoothly, I know what some of the issues are related to that. So I'll talk about that with you again on an individual basis. So today we're going to be looking at a new sample. I've put it up on Canvas, so this will again be in the Unit 3 module, and some of my classes might look a little different, but this is the sample here. It's entitled Sample 2. It might be entitled Sample 2 NASA also, but this sample, I selected this because I wanted, for the sake of fairness and like experimentation and stuff like that, I wanted to pick sample papers that had topics nobody in my classes had. So it took a bit of finding to get like a really interesting one, but that's not to say that that's not to say that the papers aren't interesting, but rather I wanted one that had a lot of meat on its bones that we could talk about. And so this one, much like the last one, is in fact very interesting, and it has things that we can talk about. So I've gotten a lot of questions about the Unit 3 assignment, both in emails and in the assorted homework assignments. And I've sent out responses to people clarifying what you're going to need, but I'll also explicitly state it here as well. And then also look at this draft to see if it fulfills those things. So this is what you're going to need to do. And I'll just like copy and paste this into, let's say, so you're going to need to meaningfully address your stakeholder, first of all. So your audience should be able to tell what your stakeholder's argument is. So you should probably include that in your paper itself. Let me make these larger, actually. Boom. So this has a number of functions. First of all, it makes your audience for this paper is me, for instance. I need to know what your stakeholder's argument is beyond just what I've read in Unit 3. And in fact, you might have an entirely different argument from that stakeholder that you'd like to address in this paper versus what you've done for Unit 2. Or did I mix those up? I don't remember. In any case, you should include their argument in some way. You need to be quoting them and responding to them in your paper in some fashion. So I want to see that explicitly in your paper. One function this serves is, of course, to give me some sense of what that stakeholder's argument was. But the other thing is that if you were to actually, and this is how we should approach this assignment, if you were to actually give this argument to your stakeholder, send it in as a letter, in fact, or some other means, this shows that you know what their argument is to the stakeholders themselves. And so that's a great way to do that sort of empathetic mode of argumentation that we've been talking about. It's a great way to do rhetorical listening. That has both an ethical imperative, so that's just generally a good thing to do, to care about somebody else in some way, like in a certain sense. But it also gets you a little bit in the way of pulling them in, let's say. It really pulls people closer to you and makes them more open and receptive to what you want to say when you show that you're hearing them too. Any good negotiator will tell you that. So, you must meaningfully address your stakeholder. The other part is that you need to demonstrate rhetorical choices that are effective for your stakeholder and that are free of fallacies and tonal issues. Obviously, this is the ideal scenario. You might fall like a little bit short of that, but that's okay. We're just practicing. That's the point of this. So please refer back to the audio lectures that I put up for what I mean by these things, rhetorical choices and fallacies. So you're going to need to use, for instance, by rhetorical choices I mean the rhetorical proofs, ethos, pathos, and logos. I want you to be not explicitly saying, I am using pathos in order to argue to you, or something like that, but rather, like, just, use it. So those kinds of rhetorical choices. You must also use concessions and counter arguments. So you have to talk about those to a certain extent. I want you to be able to foresee those things and incorporate those into your paper. And for fallacies, there was a whole audio file about that. A talk I had with my colleague Charlie. All of those video or audio lectures I think should be very helpful to you, and that's why. Well, I had there were 4 of them last week, and they were altogether probably about an hour to an hour and 15 minutes or something like that. So that's a lot to listen to. But if there are any questions about those, again, come talk to me. I know for the fallacies, it can be a little bit dicey. But as I read through your rough drafts, I'm going to be pointing those out as I see them. So don't worry about that. Just try your best to get your words and your argument down for your rough draft. So the third thing you need to keep in mind is that you need to attempt to persuade them of something. So I should know what you want in particular by the end of the paper. You don't necessarily need to say it at the beginning. You might put it somewhere else. That's fine. But I should know what you're trying to argue. If it's at all obscured or confusing, or if you have like a billion different things that you want them to do, that's not going to be good enough, to be honest, for this assignment. So you need to specifically argue something. And here's what I've talked about in class before, when I talked about the pitfalls with this assignment. So you're going to need to include additional research. You can't just get by on research you have done already. Now, you'll probably, what I think many people will do is reuse some stuff from Unit 2, and you can do that if it's about your stakeholder especially. So obviously you might have looked at their argument and decided you want to respond to that argument, and that just happened to be something that you included in Unit 2. That's fine if you want to include that in your paper. It's part of your stakeholder's argument. It's part of your stakeholder's, background, their history, etc. You can use that stuff. But I want you to use additional research. I want you to have research about, for instance, them as stakeholders. I want to know more about them than you probably wrote in Unit 2. And I also want more research about this, or to help support the additional arguments that you are actually making now. I want to see you back these up in some way with something substantial. you're going to need to do like additional research here. You didn't have to necessarily do that for Unit 2, but you do here. Alright, so this is what you need to do, basically. So you need to pick a stakeholder, which you've all done, I'm assuming. You need to address their argument. You need to attempt to convince them something and use specific rhetorical choices to do that. So that's a pretty basic level, or that's the assignment broken down to a pretty basic level. On, say, Thursday or Friday, I'm going to be talking about the rubric, and it's going to refer back to stuff like this. So as you are writing your rough draft, please use this as a sort of guide for you. And I'll put this up in the discussion post itself, as a matter of fact, so you don't have to just like go back to the video. Alright, back to the sample. So I'm going to take a break right now, and then I'm going to come back to this, and I will sort of walk us through this paper, talk about it a bit. Who is it addressing? How are they addressing it? What's going really well in the paper, and also what might need a little bit more work. What would I like to see, for instance, from a revision? All right. Okay, so this paper is about NASA and how it gets funding. This paper is directed to Congress people because they are largely determinative of the budget for various federal programs. They ratify the budget every year and determine like how much funding gets allocated to various programs and parts of the government. So the author believes that NASA should be well funded. It uses various forms of evidence, some logos, some pathos, some ethos, in order to sort of give its points. And, well, let's just walk through it, in fact. So it starts off using pathos. It has this like hypothetical situation that the author is painting of, looking up at the night sky and seeing the milky darkness. Space in and of itself is the great paradox. This is very heavy stuff, but it's meant to evoke like certain imagery in people's minds as they read. You should be thinking of space as this profound, profound area of exploration, let's say. And so that has a lot of pathos with it. It plays on certain emotions that people might feel. So I think that this is a pretty good move. Insofar as it is leading up to the discussion of NASA and like the sort of real subject, I think that that's totally fine to start off with an anecdote like that, to sort of set up the kind of mindset or framework or emotional state in your audience. I think that it might be to your advantage to do something like this, to have an anecdote. So that might be something that you incorporate into your own paper, as a matter of fact. So it starts off with that anecdote, that hypothetical situation rather, and then it moves into discussion of like a history of NASA, or like a very brief history of NASA, and kind of defining it a little bit, showing like why they're important, stuff like that, and then it moves into the ask for the paper, what it wants of the stakeholder. So it says, ladies and gentlemen, this is why the federal government should consider the following budget proposal, and that proposal is some ways later, or a little bit later. And then it has some like pointed like pathosy language here. We sit at the door of a world unknown, beckoning to us. All that we must do now is open it. So that might be a little a lot of this might be on the nose and like very very obvious and like almost corny, but all the same, it might not be too, and that all depends on your audience as well. So please think about that as you're writing. What do you think the audience would want out of this? So this was an okay section in introducing NASA and their position, and also what the author is asking of the stakeholder. Okay. Then it moves into like how it could be achieved and what exactly, what the author wants. It talks about how NASA is given 0.4% of the annual federal budget, 1/30th of the defense budget. And then it makes the proposal here, more or less. A small reallocation could quite possibly double the budget of NASA while barely making a dent into the pools of funding for the country's military. And then it gives some like supporting stuff too for that. And then it establishes why the Congress people are the ones that should or that have the final say for this thing. So this is a really good move here, like this sentence in particular, along with the previous sentences in this paragraph, because this paragraph is giving the stakeholder what exactly the author wants. It's giving them some background about why what they're talking about, and it's also establishing why that stakeholder is the one they should be talking to. So it's talking about like budgeting and stuff like that, and obviously that is the purview of Congress. But it's like in this paper, it serves to establish why the stakeholder might be the right one for like the address here. And that's something that you need to do in your paper. You should be able to tell your stakeholder, either through a direct address or not, you should be able to tell them why, you should be able to tell them why what you want is something they can do, let's say. So they should be able to see that at the very least. And then the following sections talk about, or like give answers to the why. If the stakeholder asked why would we want to do this, why would we want to like double their annual federal budget or something like that, these sections are basically like the main body, let's say. So let's go back up. Okay, first of all, in the sort of first paragraph or first section, it talks about how NASA actually does make a lot of money. So this does another thing, and it addresses the counter argument that NASA is over budgeted, and as it says, where does it say that? Yeah, so it moves through this section, talks about Neil deGrasse Tyson, talks about how it has 1,000% return on investment. It turns out 180 billion in GDP. It uses sources to back this up also, so you're going to need to do that in some way, especially if you use logos like this. If you have specific facts and figures, you should be able to tell people where you're getting that information from. But it talks about that, and then it talks about, it in fact addresses this. It says, these points are important because they combat one of the most direct arguments against an expansion of NASA's budget. Critics of the organization will argue that NASA does not provide enough of a return on investment to merit a budget expansion. So it then talks about, and it makes some concessions here is what it's doing. It's talking about like some of the failed projects and stuff like that. But it still talks about how it has a pretty good return, and it addresses that counter argument. So then it moves away from the economic opportunity, as it says, into like sort of benefiting mankind through technological progress, let's say. technologies have bettered like the human quality of life worldwide, let's say. So it talks about various technologies, MRI machines, smoke detectors, ultrasound. I think it's not addressed here. I think microwaves were also part of this, and so like all of these things drastically changed people's quality of life, as you might imagine. So it devotes a paragraph to talking about this. Then it also moves into a sort of cultural argument, let's say. So it says basically that NASA is of importance as a promoter of science. And so I think that this is also a good like sort of pathos argument present here. All right, and then we sort of move into, it's kind of hard because I really think that, and this is one of my criticisms of this paper, and there aren't that many because I think this is an excellent paper. I think the way it addresses counter arguments and stuff like that is good. I think the evidence it uses is good. I think the rhetorical strategies are good as well, but the structure is a little bit something else. So here is where, somewhere in here, I would split this up into multiple paragraphs, because this is about like almost 1.5 pages for just this paragraph, and it's talking about multiple things, and that's why I say that. So it's talking about like the cultural level of importance for NASA, but then it also starts talking about criticisms. So I would start a new paragraph right here, and to do that, I mean, obviously you would just indent it basically, but the way it is written now, it makes it seem like these two sets of ideas are connected, and I don't think that's necessarily the case. It doesn't really follow, and so it's rather hard to read, in fact, when you have when you don't space out your sections or your paragraphs, well enough. So then it moves into basically like criticisms of NASA. It's addressing counter arguments here once again. It talks about how it doesn't justify a large budget increase because of the return on investment. It then talks about the big thing, which is the private sector solutions and how people perceive them as being better. So it talks about Elon Musk's SpaceX, the Falcon Heavy rocket, the Rocket League. So yeah, it's got a lot of private sector discussion going on. It addresses this by way of saying, yeah, the private sector is good, but it's also incredibly reliant on NASA too. And so in doing the research, it has helped to show that. So it says, when the government shut down last, NASA was able to continue most of its research uninhibited. However, day-to-day operations were hindered, which meant they were unable to cooperate with companies like SpaceX and Rocket Lab, which is really important because there's a lot of collaboration that goes on between the federal government and the private sector here, especially with NASA. So it then says, it goes on to say, rather, that ironically it was the private sector that suffered during the shutdown. SpaceX relies heavily on NASA for much of what goes on day to day, and so it has a source to sort of back that up. So it's addressing that counter argument in a meaningful and direct way, and using evidence in order to do so. And that's something that you're going to need to do in your paper. You're going to need to employ like these kinds of things. You're going to need to know enough about your topic to be able to foresee what people are going to come back at you with. So like the Dan Cohen video that we watched about arguing, that TED Talk, where he was sort of modeling that argument, or like giving an example of that, where like the person was giving them an argument, and then he was coming back, and then they were coming back at him, and then he was going back at them about something else, and then they addressed all of his concerns. That's kind of what you're going to need to do too, pretty much. You're going to need to make those or you're going to need to address those potential counter arguments. And when you do that, you'll get well, first of all, you'll build your ethos for the paper, but you're also going to give your author, or your audience, let's say your stakeholder, a sense that you know possibly what their concerns are. And obviously there might be some like, this is a very big stakeholder, Congress people, let's say. It's not specific, it's not an individual, so there might be some people that have other concerns with that, the proposition being made here. But all the same, I think that making these counter arguments is still important, because this is something that, based on the research that the author did, this is something that they knew would be important to discuss. It's a very common argument made against NASA funding, for instance, that the private sector does things better, and it's like that for a lot of things. In fact, that argument is often there. It's there for instance, NASA, but it's also there for like education. It's there for health insurance, stuff like that. So that's a counter argument that a lot of you probably are going to have to address in your topics. All right. So it then moves into some more ethos to sort of corroborate a lot of what it's saying here. But then it moves into, it moves into the concluding section, let's say. So another ethos move. So first of all, in conjunction with this section here, it brings up Robert Frost, a NASA flight director and controller, talks about, why the private sector, can be good, but it also talks about how NASA can do things that nobody else can because of like the connections it has, because of like how it collaborates, like for instance internationally on like various things. Then it moves into the concluding section, and it starts it off talking about Apollo 11 Captain Michael Collins, and he had a quote: "It's human nature to stretch, to go, to see, to understand. Exploration is not a choice, really; it's an imperative." So, again, this is an ethos move, bringing up a quote like this, but it's also pathosy too. We can see in this quote there are shades of the kinds of emotions that are brought up by this hypothetical like scenario, by this imagery here too. So it's bookending the paper with this kind of pathos, and then doing it again here at the end. And I think that's a really good move, ultimately. So then it talks about the focal point. It just basically sums up the paper more or less. So what this paper is doing well, I think the intro is well tailored. This stuff, this followed by this. I think the evidence is well suited to the stakeholder. It's straightforward. They're very concerned in Congress with, especially when talking about the budget, they want to talk about the numbers, because that matters a lot to them. So you want to use some logos there, and so I think that the author was shrewd in doing so here, especially. The thing that I think the paper does the best is address the counter arguments. So it talks about like the funding, but more importantly, it talks about how the private sector is also reliant on NASA in a certain way, and so it provides its own like counter argument basically to like their stakeholders, objections, let's say. What I would like to see from a revision, I think this paper is excellent. I wouldn't really dock it for much, except for Like, where was that thing? That part where it starts talking about the private sector. Yeah. This to me, I don't know if it was intentional or not, but this shouldn't be like the same paragraph. It needs to be like split here. And really all you need to do is like indent it, because it's literally saying it's moving on to like another idea here. And so that's a structural issue with the paper. And so it's a very small thing, but it's a very meaningful thing for certain audiences, like myself, who read things, who take this very seriously. I get really deep into reading these drafts and try to take them in. And so when there's stuff like this, it can be a barrier to understanding, let's say. It can be confusing. And when you're reading a paragraph that goes on for a page and a half, you start to get really tired too. And so that's true even of, like I'm a comp teacher, but for the congressman, do you think they want to read like a page and a half of a single paragraph? I think that would be rather difficult. So your paragraph breaks are breaks between ideas, and they give your audience a breather. And so that's what I would critique there. The other thing I would critique is the fact that I want to know what 4.4% of the annual federal budget is, in terms of, or like what exactly the dollar value is that the author is proposing that they raise it to. I think that could be something. I don't think that's necessary here, but it kind of, because it gestures at it enough that I don't think it's really that important. But it's good to be as specific as possible whenever you're doing a proposal. So having a dollar amount could have been a good thing here, but ultimately I don't think it was like necessary. I think the biggest thing, and even though it's rather small, would be that like sort of section here, where I would like for them to more clearly divide the sections of the paper. Alright, so I highly encourage you to run through this and look through it, especially with an eye to those counter arguments, because I think this paper does this even better than the first paper that we looked at. And so you're going to need to do something like that in your own paper. Obviously this was extremely robust. It spent multiple paragraphs talking about that counter argument, but you still need to make the attempt to address that in some meaningful way. So that's what I encourage. Alright, so later on this week I'll be going over the Unit 3 rubric with all of you, so that'll probably be a rather short video, or it won't be a short video, but for the prompt today I want to open that up to you. And I'll include this below this video, in fact, on our discussion board. But the prompt for this video basically is, what is the most important question that you have about this assignment? What do you want to know? What questions do you still have? Because we've been talking about it for a couple weeks now, and that's really, I think I've given a lot of details and stuff like that, but I would still like to specifically address these things, these concerns that you have too. So to that end, in the same video I talk about the rubric, I'll also include responses to those questions. So there are probably going to be duplicates like among all my classes, and that's okay. So if you have the same question as somebody else, it's alright to put that in the discussion response, but I still want you to talk about what confuses you, because I'm certainly not able to cover everything in these videos that I make by myself, after all. So questions are good here. So please send me your questions and we'll see if we can get some clarity. But again, the prompt is, what is the most important question that you have about this assignment? So please write that below. I'm going to go through them and include my responses like as a Q&A section at the end of the rubric video. So that'll probably be like half the length of the video, more or less. And I'll try and make it as efficient as possible so we're not sitting there for an hour or something like that. All right. Have a good day, y'all.